citizens have. And one of those is to work for peace. And we do that through our peacebuilding policy program, as well as through our efforts to try to work for nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, to work for human rights and civil liberties. Many of you know our work. We're lobbying on the Hill on a regular basis, but we invite you to come and join us for events here. We also have a Wednesday time of silent reflection from 5:15 till 6, which we think of as another way to provide a kind of service by holding people in prayer and in our intentions for a better world. So I first learned about Scilla Elworthy from Bridget Moix. And Bridget, many of you know, has a history with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, helping to start our prevention of deadly conflict, the peaceful prevention of deadly conflict program. And she has come back to work with us now and is, in effect, the chair of my board, which is pretty amazing and exciting for me. We had our first board meeting last weekend, and it was really great. So we're really happy to have Bridget here. So the connection, of course, is Peace Direct. Bridget is the representative for Peace Direct here in Washington, D.C., and Scilla is the founder of Peace Direct. But Scilla, of course, has a bio that is much longer than that. She was the founder of the Oxford Study Group, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that work. She helped launch the Elders Group that has had an impact in conflict situations around the globe. She has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times. She has a new book, A Business Plan for Peace. And when I saw this book, Bridget showed me an early copy, I thought, this is the book that every member of Congress should read. And as I said to Scilla, they could read it on their flight home, you know, when they're flying back to the district. It's a pretty direct book. Yeah, we have to figure out how to make that happen. So the other thing is she has a wonderful TED Talk, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to be the 1.3,107th viewer of it, because it's been seen a lot. So anyway, with gratitude to Scilla, I'm going to ask Bridget to come up and introduce just a very brief film, and then Scilla is going to speak, and we'll go on from there.
Thank you, Diane. It is really warming to be in this space and to be back at FCNL. I actually started as an intern here many years ago with Ora and others, and Lynn. Gosh, wow. So it's lovely to be here and to be here with Scilla. I want to introduce a short video we have. It's 1 minute long about Peace Direct. I think most of you know Peace Direct and our work. We work with local people to prevent and stop violent conflict and build sustaining peace. And we have 13 partners in 12 countries around the world and work with a much even bigger and broader network of local peacebuilding experts in countries of conflict as well. So we really believe local people are the experts in the problems that they face, and they're the experts in the solutions that they need for their societies. So I won't say more, I'll just introduce this little video, and Maya's gonna help me find it. And this is to give you more of a picture of what we do. One more time. One more time. There we go. I hope you love that video as much as I do. And I should say that the film is from our partner in Nigeria, Peace Initiatives Network, and they do fabulous work. And Michael's been here a couple times and will probably be back this year again. And should give credit to our corporate partner, Away, who helped us make that beautiful video. So Scylla, I want to turn it over to you now. And thank you so much for being here with us.
This is such a joy for me because it's not only the connection through peace to be here with you, but it's also the Quaker Connection. I was introduced to Quakerism in 1990, and for the last however long that is, it's been an absolutely essential source for me of quietness and wisdom. And in fact, my main mentor was a man called Adam Curl, who was the first professor of peace studies in Britain at the Bradford University, which was where I did my doctorate. So he coached me and ticked me off when I went wrong and helped me to make better decisions along the way. So I'll say just a minimal amount about what we did so you can situate it. In 1982, I was horrified by the amount of technology, knowledge, information, and money that was going into the Reagan nuclear weapons buildup. And I decided, if this was in New York in 1982 at the second special session of the UN on disarmament, that I was amazed that there were 1 million people in New York, all come specially. The New York Times gave it 5 pages. I went back into work at the UN next day, expecting everything to have changed. Not one country had changed its position 1 centimeter. And I was dejected, a strap hanging on a tram on Broadway on my way home. And suddenly I got this thing that said, you're talking to the wrong people. You must find out who actually makes decisions on nuclear weapons and talk to them. So I thought, who's that then? And we figured it out. It's the physicists who actually build the warheads, the intelligence people who inform why we need a new set of weapons, the people who build the platforms, the submarines, the missiles, and so on, the people who write the checks, the people, the military who design the strategy, and last of all, the politicians. So we set out to map that for all the then nuclear weapons nations. That was the P5, basically, the then Soviet Union, United States, Britain, France, and China. And everybody said, you are mad. But we pressed ahead, and 4 years later, we published, with a lot of Quaker help, I have to say, from what we call the chocolate charities. That's the Roundtrees and Cadburys who made lots of money out of chocolate and turned it into foundations. And they helped us from the very beginning and still do. And so our first book was called How Nuclear Weapons Decisions Are Made, and it had wiring diagrams of how the whole system works, connecting each department in each country to the other departments that they worked with, and people were just astonished. Fast forward, I began to realize how essential it was to actually talk to and listen to these individuals. It was no good just being angry and fearful. And so I had to do the inner work that Quakerism's taught me a lot about to resolve my own crises of strong emotions, because otherwise, you know what happens. We project that out onto the people we're trying to engage in discussion, unconsciously often. So I had to really deal with those issues in myself to turn them around so I can listen to people as human beings. I might totally disapprove of what they did, but not hate them as human beings. And that was crucial. And as a result, gradually, we were able to invite those individuals to come to a Quaker retreat center outside Oxford and meet their opposite numbers. So the head of nuclear warhead development from Los Alamos came to meet his opposite number from the Soviet Union, and then also extend that to China. We made 7 visits with delegations to China. So we were being as inclusive as we could, but the key thing was to also bring in people who'd been in the business and opted out, usually for ethical reasons. So the head of warhead development at Aldermaston in the UK a man called Frank Barnaby joined our group, our research group. It was called Oxford Research Group. And he then became the leader of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, who any of you who do this kind of work will know well. So we had very highly informed people able to hold their own with these very experienced policymakers. After doing this for 21 years, I decided I would like to hand it over to people who could do it much better than I could, and who went on to support well below the radar, nobody knew about their role, the Iran-US talks on nuclear weapons that took place 2-3 years ago. And they did that with great skill, and they're now involved, very highly involved in the Middle East. So the reason I wanted to shift from working at the top, if you like, was that I had this hunch that at the grassroots, everything was changing. I had this hunch that people were taking their own lives in their hands to stop other people killing each other. So I asked a young researcher if he would go and find out whether this was true. And over a period of a year, he was able to identify 350 such initiatives. And they met our criteria for responsible funding, accountability, and monitoring and evaluation. And so we wrote another book about the 50 most important and interesting, and we started Peace Direct in 2002, exactly a year after the 9/11 bombings. We held an event in the Opera House in London called Transforming September 11th, because everybody was going into the war on terror mentality, and we wanted people to hear about people who were working with terrorists and turning them around. So with a lot of music and poetry and great stars like Julie Christie coming along and helping us, that's what we did on those 3 evenings. And Peace Direct was born. And I'm utterly thrilled by what's happening now, because the same young man who did the original research and then went off to work on clearing landmines, he has now become the CEO of Peace Direct. That's Dylan Matthews. Bridget knows very well. And he and Bridget have helped to bring the US part of Peace Direct really up to working at its full height. Maybe not full, not yet, very soon, but it makes it, I can't tell you, I get a lump in my throat. Well, first of all, I don't know about you, but I had goosebumps watching that film about how this is being transformed. And when I hear from Bridget what different groups in this country are doing, and also locating on a map all the peace building initiatives taking place in the United States. And Bridget will talk about that a bit later. But let me just carry on to talk about what happened when we did the same survey as we'd done in 1999. We did the same survey last year, and we found that this number of 350 viable, locally led initiatives has swelled to over 1,500. So that hunch that something was going on was right. And a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is due to the kind of support and encouragement and communication that Peace Direct has been able to share with these incredibly brave people. I'd like to just give you an example. This is a story that I love telling. It's my favorite peace builder in the world, and her name is Gululai Ismail. And she lives in the northwest part of Pakistan, possibly the most dangerous place in the world to be a woman. And she started getting young women into school when she was aged 16. And her colleague, Malala Yousafzai, was shot in the head for doing exactly that. Completely undeterred, Gululai went on, and now has trained over 200 young men and young women to have the right attitude and approach to go into the madrasas, the teaching schools, to identify those being trained for jihad and go home with them to their families and talk to their families about why the Quran would not approve of suicide bombing. And they've managed to dissuade over 200 young jihadis from carrying out their mission. Now, if that isn't prevention, I don't know what is. Imagine the numbers of deaths that they have prevented by doing just that. And the sheer amount of courage it takes. Gulilai's life is threatened more or less every day. She got a call from her dad when she was getting off a plane to come home, and he said, "Don't come home tonight. The house is surrounded by armed men looking for you." So I can't, I'm dazed by this woman's courage. And I've talked to her about it, and she's very, very matter of fact. So it's been an incredible learning for me, an incredible experience to meet and work with such people, and at the same time to continue some of the dialogues I have with people in ministries of defense, very senior in the military, in the physics departments making nuclear warheads and so on. So let me just give you, if you'll forgive me, a few numbers, because the new research just done by the Institute for Economics and Peace in Australia, and they work in conjunction with the Economist Intelligence Unit, they've just come out with the fact that the world spends $14.3 trillion on containing violence and violent conflict. And of that 14.3 trillion, 0.9% is spent on peace building and 1.1% on peacekeeping. So if we were to calculate how much is actually spent on really preventing armed violence rather than containing it, it would be less than 1% of that amount. And this is what we have to change. Because if all those initiatives that Peace Direct has identified, both there and here in the United States, had decent funding and guidance in building teams, capacity building, as well as media coverage, because all of them tell us that they are safer when a Western media, a newspaper or a film has noticed them. That makes them safer. So what I've done in this book is I suddenly realized, why is it that nobody has written about the nuts and bolts of this in terms of what could be done if more funds were available? So what I did was to take 25 initiatives or systems that we know work, that we've been able to test and prove over the years, and scale them up over a period of 10 years and to cover a much wider area. So this includes people who are groups of women who are insisting that they be allowed to sit on peace negotiations. Why? Because currently, or until very recently, only 2.5% of those with a place at the table were women. And the reason, the result of this was that the considerations and the needs of those worst affected by armed conflict, children, old people, and the injured, were not brought into the agreement. And this is why half of those agreements fell apart in 10 years. And now that they've upped the percentage of women by these women in these countries putting forth their CVs and saying, I am qualified to be a negotiator in the next round of peace talks, that is what's beginning to change it. I think it's up to only about 10% now, but still, it's a huge improvement on 2.5. We want to get it obviously to 50 or more. So that's one of the things that we're encouraging, and we're working closely with the Institute for Inclusive Security here in Washington. They do a wonderful job on that. So in every case of those that I've investigated, there's a principle, a system of how the thing works, an example of it in practice, and then a costing. And it probably will surprise you if I tell you that these 25 systems expanded widely and over a period of 10 years, the total cost comes to $2 billion. And we currently spend $9 billion on ice cream every year, let alone the fact that global militarization costs $1.686 billion a year. So this is 2 billion as compared to 1.686 billion, where 30 billion would end starvation worldwide and 10 billion would provide clean water to every person on the planet. How have we got into this mad situation where we're spending this much on destruction? This is what I wanted to try and make clear. So I wanted just to conclude by telling you a little bit about how it feels to do this work. And as Bridget or somebody mentioned, I was working with Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop, and Richard Branson, setting up the elders. Now, that was Peter Gabriel's idea that the world is a global village and needs wise elders. And for one reason or another, they got in a muddle about how to do it, and I was called. And so we spent 3 years working out who should be the elders, what should be their criteria for their work, and how many of them. And I did 300 biographies of potential elders with a very great stress on the feminine. And I had to really struggle to get even 5 out of the final 12 were female. And eventually Nelson Mandela made the final choice. But what struck me most in all those 3 years was being in the presence of Nelson Mandela. It would have been a room a bit bigger than this with about 60 people in it. And he walked in leaning heavily on Peter Gabriel's arm and sat down and started to talk. Mandela is not an orator. He doesn't do oratorical flourishes. He's got a raspy voice. But when he started to speak, I got goosebumps. 35 minutes later, when he finished speaking, I still had goosebumps. And so I asked myself, what is this? What is going on here? And it took me a long time to work out that what I was getting was the actual energy of this man's integrity. It was a visceral proof of the fact that here was somebody you couldn't push around, you couldn't cajole, you couldn't bribe. There was no way that you could divert him from the true mandate that he had. And he set up something that's very little known, but vital for what we're talking about. He set up in South Africa the council structure for peace councils throughout the country. There was one at national level, one at regional level, one at city level. All the towns had to have a peace council and all the villages. And these were people who were popular and loved in the community. They weren't elected by a national vote. They were put forward by people who could show how valuable they were to the community. And their mandate was to work out a peace plan for their area, be it a village or be it a capital city. So that if armed violence broke out, then immediately this plan could be put into action. And that, I know, because I lived there for 10 years, is what prevented civil war in South Africa between 1989, when Mandela came out of jail, and 1994, when the first elections were held. That structure, known either as an architecture for peace or an infrastructure for peace, has now been copied by Kenya and by Ghana. And there are other countries like Malawi who are thinking about it. And it's one of the initiatives that I put forward in this book, because it only costs $2 million, not billion, $2 million to set up such an architecture in a country. In other words, to train the people, to see that they're up to the mark, that they do develop a peace plan and that it works. So this is, to me, this is one of the greatest economies that any country which is on the verge of descending into violence could put in place, because it's using the people. I mean, the people on these councils are midwives, teachers, sports personalities, even film stars, religious people, and people that the community love and trust. And so that's what makes their work so valuable. So this is just an example of how using the gem, the diamond people in a community, such as Peace Direct does, is the way to ensure the path to peace of those communities. So I'll stop just in a moment and we can do more of a discussion. But I just want to say that the last part of the book is entirely, the last 3 chapters are entirely devoted to what we as ordinary people can do in our own communities. Because a lot of people think, oh, well, that's great that different organizations get busy out there somewhere else. But actually, if we want a peaceful future for our children, we have to get busy right here. And so I suggest 31 different things that people can do in their local schools, in their community, in their workplace, and in the family. So what we teach, what my book has exercises on, is how to learn to listen to somebody with whom you have a fight. And you wouldn't think that listening can change it, but I think Quakers know how it can, because if the person with whom you are in sharp disagreement is thinking, I'm right and she's wrong, and I'm thinking, I'm right and he's wrong, we're working at the level of the brain and the mental process. Whereas if I listen to that person for, say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and really listen, giving him my full attention, and then feeding back to him what I've heard, he feels fully heard. And everybody's expression changes when that happens. From, frowning and feeling very tense, the whole body relaxes, and the attention moves from the brain, I'm right and you're wrong, to the heart, which says, oh my God, is that how he feels? And that's when you get progress. That's when you get a breakthrough. So in the appendix to my book, there's a lot of exercises of that kind that teach people the basics. But the fundamental of it all is learning to use silence to expand our self-awareness, our self-knowledge. I talked earlier about how I started this work feeling very angry and very afraid. So that would be unconsciously spat out at the people I was talking to. Whereas if I can transform those emotions, get really conscious of them, then I can change them in myself. So my communication is then much cleaner and clearer. And that's when this kind of communication, a lot of people call it nonviolent communication. Has anybody come across NVC here? I'm sure lots of people have. It's very much a part of Quaker work everywhere, I think. And I love it. If I could get everybody to do an NVC course, I would. But the kind of thing that we can do is to, for example, a lot of our kids at the moment, our teenagers or preteens, are really anxious about what's happening in the world, the headlines. They feel unsafe, they feel threatened. And because a lot of the stories that they're reading or hearing or seeing on TV are about young people who have done horrific things. And one of the ways that we find works with kids that age is to get hold of the local media, the local radio station, the local TV station, and say, instead of a making celebrities out of people who've done terrible things, putting their photo on the front pages, and so on. We want you to make heroes of the people we know who do great things. So we call that, I'm sure you've got a version of it here, but we call it a local hero list. And they then put forward the biographies of the kids they know who are doing wonderful things. And if the local newspaper or radio station catches on, then they run a weekly update of the local hero list. So kids who would otherwise not have their generosity acclaimed and noticed suddenly end up in the newspaper with their biography there. And this is a way to really encourage other young people that it's not hopeless and that what you do locally is really, really important. So I think that's a good place for us to get into a discussion.
I'm going to turn, thank you, Scylla. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn it over to Theo to introduce Daphna, who's going to respond and help us bring this into the context of legislation and policy in Congress. But I just want to appreciate, I've been with Scylla for a few days now, and every time I hear her talk, she gives me more food for thought about how we link policy and high-level policy and community-level work, how we link issues, and how we link the inner work and the outer work in the world. So I think that is a great jumping off point for further discussion. I was also trained at FCNL that when you're across the street from Congress, you got to know what Congress is doing and figure out how do you take these lessons and this work and engage with Congress. So I want to ask Theo to introduce our next respondent.
Hi everyone, welcome. So I'm Theo Sitter. I direct our peacebuilding policy program here at FCNL. And Daphna Rand is the VP for Policy and Research at Mercy Corps. And at FCNL, we're a lobbying organization. We lobby members of Congress and we push for better US foreign policy that's more peaceful, that's less militarized. And we do that across all of our foreign policy work. And Mercy Corps is one of those organizations that we love working closely with. Because of their experience on the ground, they also produce a body of research and knowledge that all of us have access to. So we're very excited to have Daphna here join us to talk about some of the initiatives that they're doing, and particularly, as Bridget said, to help us, for those of us who are working here in Washington in policymaking and working closely with policymakers to help contextualize Celeste's talk. So yeah, welcome Daphna, and we're excited to hear you.
I apologize if I can't understand. I have a little bit of a cold this weekend. So I have to admit that I was asked to respond to this book and to the presentation and to wonkify it a bit. I think those were the words I was told over email. And so in reflecting on how to be the wonky respondent, you know, I will draw in the next few minutes on my sort of non-Mercy Corps experience. For the past 10 years, I've been a Senate staffer and an Obama official, most recently as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. So I fought these fights inside until September when I came over to Mercy Corps as the Vice President. So I excuse this sort of, you know, misrepresentation, bait and switch, but I do think that because we're sitting across from Congress and because what you say has so many implications for the status and future orientation of U.S. foreign policy, I would respond in a way that would give clear guidelines for advocacy in Washington in this very uncertain and in some ways scary times, and that the fear emotion does resonate with me too. So here you go. Here's some 5 recommendations to wonks to be and how to apply a peace building mission. I would start with a mission set that you've laid out, which is if the goal is to begin to alter the balance between the overly militarized foreign policies of the leading world powers, the overinvestments in national security, and to begin to invest more in the civilian levers of change. If that is our mission, that is our goal as policy change agents, let me offer you a few ideas of things to keep in mind. One, definitions. In Washington, using the term peace building, as everyone knows, will probably fall flat on most people's ears, either across the street or in the executive branch. I certainly must admit, having come from the State Department, when I heard the term peace building a few months ago, wasn't sure what it meant, to be honest. Never heard the term, never worked at USAID, didn't know the sector. But I believe I had been working in peace building. I've been promoting the human rights of people across the Middle East and the world. Anyway, so definitions do matter. And I would urge the group to look at the OECD's list of the 8 different constituent elements of foreign assistance that they have labeled as peace building. Because when I saw those to me offered the definition, right? Things like child soldiers, human rights, good governance, landmines is in there, right? So there's 8 constitutive elements of peace building. And most of them, interestingly, are not in the development sector. So really USAID as a bureaucratic matter does not have much say. So that's just something to keep in mind as people in the room consider who has the levers of control of peace building in the US government. So just consider that. And similarly, definitionally, CVE, PVE, human rights, it is good for optics and spinning to conflate them. So there's a room and a time to conflate this to conflict prevention or conflict mitigation. But there's also a very important bureaucratic mandate to be specific, to talk specifically about what you're talking about. Are you trying to prevent violence and radicalization and putative terrorists from joining ISIS or its next generation? That is a very important foreign policy goal of the United States right now and plays out in both the regional and functional foreign policy debates of our time. Are you trying to respond to conflicts that exist, change the dynamics in Syria? Are you trying to build communal peace among various communities at a more grassroots level that you think might have a propensity to trigger more national level violence? That's yet a third foreign policy of the United States. So try to have a theory of change that specifically addresses any one of those 3 or more categories, while recognizing that for political expedience, you might have to use different terminologies like peace building or the more general hypothetical term, generalized terms. Know your bureaucratic champions and your adversaries. You need to know who on the inside is fighting your fight. And I will give you an honest assessment. Most of the NGOs in Washington meet with the people who are not in the room, right? Because they have more time to meet with the NGOs. So there's actually a selection bias. If you're meeting with people at state or USAID and they seem to have all the time in the world, they're probably not in a 12-hour day in the US government on the inside of the National Security Council being the champion, fighting the opposite argument. So it's going to take a bit more work to figure out who your champions are, because they're honestly prioritizing the internal struggle over the NGO consultation element. And there's room for both, but I would just heed that and try to collect intelligence to figure out who your champion is. The adversaries matter just as much, and I don't mean adversary in a bad way, but you need to know the arguments that are pushing back against the pro-human rights. So if you believe that we have a policy in a country in Africa that's overly focused on a CT-only counterterrorism strategy, and you believe that it's counterintuitively creating more terrorists and more violence, and has a proclivity to turn communities against both the government and therefore their backers, the UK and the US, if that's your theory, right, you need to know what the counter argument is. What are the very, very smart people at the CIA, DOD, NCTC, all these agencies making it their argument? They understand that. They understand short and long term, right? Be fluent in those counter arguments and begin to deconstruct them. Because if not, then, and help and publicly deconstruct, right? Because the people who are your champions, who you don't have time to meet with, need op-eds and papers that deconstruct the counter arguments. So think about that, so know your bureaucratic champions and adversaries, and understand how Congress versus the executive branch work, right? In some ways, it's a 2-by-2. You have your champions and your adversaries in both Congress and the executive branch, although there are fewer real adversaries on the congressional side, I would say, just oversight jurisdictions that make people quite loyal in Congress to a part of DOD or state that they're trying to defend. Although things are changing in Congress right now, and I think there's much, I've noticed in the past year, much more energy on national security oversight than there was during any of the times that I was on the inside of the Obama administration. So I would say that on the bureaucratics, there's a real amenable moment right now with congressional oversight. And I would just point to the willingness of the Senate Armed Services Committee and a little bit less House Armed Services, but certainly both of those DOD authorizing bodies to push back and do oversight on DOD in a way that was unprecedented in the past 10 years. That to me is a litmus test. It's not sufficient, oversight, but it's certainly a changing willingness of some, not all staffers in both committees to push back on DOD, where usually DOD has done a great job of masterfully getting its minders in Congress to do its bidding. So not dispositive change, but certainly an indicator of an opening. Don't assume that the communities that you know speak to each other, right? So don't assume that you've been on the ground in Kenya and you know various communities that have thought about election violence, past and future, and have written about it, and you've done people-to-people negotiations, and you've worked on a CSO grant, and you know CSO cold, and everyone in Kenya, and the CSO is a bureau at the State Department. Don't assume the ambassador has any idea of what the lessons are of that CSO program that you're so fluent in, right? It's your job, because you have more mobility and you have more flexibility, to connect the dots for people on the inside, between national security, foreign policy, peacemaking, NGO, et cetera. That's extremely important. And in that sense, I would point to the Elie Wiesel Act, which I think FCNL was behind, right? Which I noted in reading it for the very first time yesterday in preparation for this, that what it does is it authorizes the Atrocity Prevention Board, something that I was part of, and went to almost all the meetings for a number of years, which is a very good and important authorizing technique and tactic bureaucratically. In terms of connecting the dots, I would urge the champions in Congress of that bill to think about the other parts of levers in authorizing language that would force multiply the objectives of that bill. So Atrocity Prevention Board, I think everyone agreed after the Obama administration did do some good, but there are other parts of the sort of normal non-APB routes that achieve similar objectives, right? So that would be an example of connecting the dots. Connect your people from USAID and state who are just doing APB all day long to the Nigeria IPC. IPC is Inter-Policy Committee, right? It's the main body that does Nigeria policy for the US government. Those people might or might not have heard of APB, right? As you all know. Okay, you get the point. And finally, balance strategy and tactics. It's very important that outsiders, just like the internal champions who you don't know yet, but you will get to know, have a theory of change that's very specific and balance that theory of change with the tactics. So for example, my theory of change for the past 2 years, last 2 years of my service in the State Department, was that the national security emphasis on BPC, building partnership capacity, which was the term that was used by Obama first, and around 2014 in his War College West Point speech, would have the negative externality, would have the negative effect of assuming that all partners would A, accord by US military professional standards, and B, share the threat assessment of the United States. So by outsourcing, essentially, my theory of change was I was worried that in outsourcing the fight to partners and foreign militaries and people that could potentially do the war fighting for the US military, the US was losing some of its leverage over both their professionalism and their capacity and their objectives in a way that would dangerously, would not achieve mission, but also, erode human rights and justice and dignity for the people living in these communities. My theory of change was that, therefore, what we needed to work on was ensuring that DoD, as part of its package in its military-to-military cooperations, inherently had a theory or a way of leveraging its assistance to outcome and to professionalism and to the behavior of these partner base. So that was my theory of change. And so as I had that theory of change for the past 2 years of government, I would look and I would note in country after country and discussion after discussion, there were tactics that could help achieve that. There were individuals working with certain militaries around the world who had themselves noted. There was lo and behold, a peacekeeping reform initiative that the president I was working for had announced at the UN and a totally separate part of the State Department, working with DoD and peacekeeping reform, which is totally central to my theory of change, right? Because if we start looking at which units are acting professionally when deployed, we have data about how they will act when receiving US security assistance at home fighting bad guys. And yet these two conversations were not linked, right? So I began to see everywhere the Child Soldiers Act, which I was formally responsible for implementing in my role as the Deputy Assistant Secretary, one of the most important advocacy achievements in my view of the past 10 years by an NGO and groups of NGO on the Hill that actually seriously changed the way the State Department looked at this problem. The Child Soldier Protection was working directly with the 8 to 9 militaries that every year were being listed starting in 2010. And I do believe that there was a positive story of change with the Chadian military that was almost entirely dispositively connected to the diplomacy exerted around that act, which conditioned security assistance against the listing. So, I mean, it's not scientific, but it's the closest thing I've seen to actual causal connectivity with diplomacy, sanctions, congressional action, bad cop, good cop, and change. And that leads me to the final one, after action. I find that both the national security community and the sort of NGO advocacy community could do a better job in studying wins and losses and applying it to the next fight, right? So here's a good case. The Chadian military went from being on the list of child soldiers to not being on the list. Why did that happen? How did the embassy receive the Child Soldier Act and the notes from the Secretary of State? How did Congress ask them and do oversight about the fact that Chad was listed and we had all kinds of terrorism, U.S. Imperatives in Chad, right? Who studied that? And who wanted then to apply it to Rwanda and Sudan and the other countries that continuously, Nigeria, that continuously are listed year after year. The Yemen arms sales debate, FCNL has been really quite involved in it. I was quite involved in it in the Obama administration. It is unprecedented to see how the lever of the FMS, the foreign military sale, became available to Congress and then available to the advocates because it was a transparent measure of our policy. It begs a lot of analytic questions, right? What happened to are there other countries? Why did it take until 2 or 3 years ago when the Obama administration started pulling Bahrain and Egypt, or Egypt's FMS, Bahrain FMS, for congressional oversight to begin to see this as a lever on U.S. national security policy? I believe it's a locked-in lesson. The learning is sort of definite and no one will forget it, and it's already being applied to countries around the world. So I do believe it's in a weird way, in a negative way, a lesson that will have tremendous effect on the congressional executive prerogative of oversight over the executive. But Yemen arms, why did the PGMs get stopped in 2016, the precision guided munitions to Saudi Arabia, but then somehow that debate has shifted a little bit in the Trump administration? Know your bureaucratic adversaries, know your bureaucratic champions, right? So Yemen would be one where the learning is critical because it's large N. There's a lot of data here. You have a lot of instances of trying. Syria war, I would point to Staffan de Mistura, who among his first acts of becoming the UN Special Envoy for the Syrian negotiations in 2015 was to come to the State Department and ask for help in identifying female civil society representatives to serve as special advisors. Understanding the lessons of women in peace negotiation, he applied it and then asked people who knew around the world which women could serve in his body. So there you have a lesson. Clearly his peace negotiations failed. But what do those women do? What do they say? At what point in those 2015 to 2016 sort of very intensive Syria negotiations do those women point him in the right direction? So knowing the difference, thinking really scientifically and understanding what levers affect what actors and how applying and not applying these levers change is really critical to the field. And so with that, I'll stop, and I welcome any discussion of any that I've thrown out a lot at you. And again, I apologize that it's not Mercy Corps specific, but I thought, given the advocacy nature, you're probably better. Let me share with you some thoughts from my experience on the inside.
Thank you, Daphna. Thank you both. We wanted to have a time of lively discussion and really a chance for all of you to perhaps respond, talk back to Scylla and to Daphna. I think if I can ask the two of you to come up to our little stage here, I think that'd be good. So, what questions do you have I think Scylla has given us the big picture analysis of how we could envision peace in our community, in our world. Daphna has given us the specific of how do we work within the U.S. government to actually push ahead. So that's the framework and the context of how I'm viewing the two talks that we heard. I would love to hear from you and open it up for some questions.
I would love to actually put both speakers on the spot and ask each other a question about each other and sort of how does this apply? How do we build to that picture and then that very concrete change work? Can we do that?
Yeah. My question to you, my feeling is you've got to kind of long way further in your strategy and your and all that you've learned about where you're. adversaries and who are your what did you call it? Champions. Lovely word. And I would love to share those with groups in the UK. So if I give you my email, then you could drop me a note with the points 1 to 5, that would be great. They could be very useful. I don't think we're nearly as either as strategic or as tactical as you have learned to be. Mind you, you've got a much bigger bureaucracy to deal with, but I have learned a lot listening to you.
I should put in a plug for my colleagues in Mercy Corps. We have a small but incredibly powerful London-based advocacy team. So I'll put you in touch, yeah. And my question to you is a historical comparison. I have found that working on issues of war and peace and shifting that balance has become incredibly difficult since 9/11 and since the more competitive international arena. So there's not clearly, the US is still sort of the unipolar superpower with some European supporters and alliances, and Russia since 2011, 2012 has, mounted an obvious challenge to that hegemony, and there's China. So that it's not only multipolar, but it's competitive. And I'm just wondering if you think about the past sort of 17 or 18 years as more difficult for this kind of advocacy than during the Cold War, where, preventing nuclear conflict was in some ways a sort of statistical, scientific, bipolar standoff that you could control the plays, right, in a sort of game theoretic way.
I would basically agree with you. If I look back over the years of 1982 to probably about 1998, I think it was easier, much easier than it is now. And a lot of that is to do with your present situation, where you have such an unpredictable leadership, constantly changing the rules of the game, changing the game plan. And the people I've talked to find that extremely difficult to keep up with. And I'm sure it's purposely so, to shake people off their strategies and their ways of bringing about change. And I would love to know what's the best way that you've found to enable the people you work with to stay focused and to stay nourished in their work.
Good question. We had a band of us at the end of the Obama administration who've been working on some of these issues, kind of the survivors who had stayed until January 19th at 1 a.m. when we are escorted out of our various buildings and told to find new lines of work. But I can just say that the people who made it, both some of the political appointees and the sort of people who are willing, and I would categorize this broadly between civil servants, foreign servants, of all the different agencies at the White House who've been willing to take stands on the inside. It takes more time at work to take stands because you've got to be doubly prepared for the next meeting and you've got to connect the dots, takes more time. So those people, there's a direct correlation between their hours at work and the moments they miss dinner and miss their families and the ability to take stands. So it was a huge cost on this band of survivors. And you saw everyone's blurry eyes and, people always say, you look so much more well rested than you did a year ago, So, and I had 3 kids during this period, so I was quite busy during these years. But there was a camaraderie that nourished us, a cultural collegiality, a sense that we were doing really important things and really important fights. I think we would all agree that we would do things differently next time if we are so lucky enough to get back into the government. But the camaraderie, the collegiality, the sense of mission really nourished us.
Diane. Okay, yeah.
So I would like to hear you both just speak a little bit more about the notion of the architecture for peace building, for the infrastructure. So you talked about it in terms of the peace councils in South Africa and the and you talked about it more from the sort of governmental side, and that in some cases that infrastructure has some gaps, right? To talk to each other. And I guess I'm interested in who's responsible for and how do we create an infrastructure that is for peace building that has both government investment and the local people? That's a pretty big question, but I'm just, if you could think of any really good examples where it's happened.
I think think it's a really important question, and I hadn't heard it posed so clearly. So thank you. And I think where they run into a lot of problems is in Kenya, where the government proposed the strategy. A lot of local NGOs and initiatives took it up. And then the government said, no, no, that wasn't what we had in mind, and threw them off the track. Now, whether that was a deliberate disincentive or not, I don't know. But it's certainly been very difficult for outsiders to understand, and very difficult to support the people involved. Whereas I think in Ghana, I don't know if other people have got experience, it's probably run more smoothly. But how it would be applied to an administration like the US administration, I have no idea. Maybe you do.
The two instances where the local NGOs, where there was sort of a scaling up, what you're talking about essentially, and a connectivity that really struck me as positive and successful, where everyone was rowing together, were Kenya before the elections of 2013, where the US government and the UK government and other donors really worked together on election prevention. Mercy Corps had a big program there called Yes You Can, working with youth. The USAID spent $50 million directly on election prevention violence. So really peace-building money, was able to marshal new funds for that last year and worked on all facets of it: the NGO capacity building, the technology, monitoring fraud, building the higher electoral commission so people felt more confident in it. So it was real top-down, bottom-up, and the government players in Kenya seemed to buy into it. So I would say that example was worth studying because everyone was connected. Tunisia after the revolution, similarly, and there it was a tabula rasa because there was no real civil society under Ben Ali. So there's an interesting moment in our recent past that we can study where, although Ben Ali said that there was 8,000, 9,000 NGOs that were all controlled by the state, by the police state. So what you saw after the fall of the regime was a real nascent and authentic civil society coming up, grassroots. And so the dovetailing and the kind of symbiosis that was really beautiful that happened between the donors coming in, not having run any programs with civil society for 15, 20 years, maybe since Bourguiba, and really being banned from having any connection to any real Tunisian people, but coming in and hearing from NGOs about how to support them. That was very interesting. OTI at USAID did some great work back then in 2011, 2012, connecting elections and local civil society and mothers groups and education groups. The World Bank was in there doing all kinds of interesting group programming. And then, of course, the quartet. Everyone knows about the quartet that won the Nobel Peace Prize, right? So those groups were the two members of rival factions of the political parties, and the unions. And when there was a constitutional crisis in 2013, they came and saved the country. And they got together and had this kind of consultative dialogue among the different political parties and the unions and the different power centers, including the Islamists and the leftists and everyone. And there, you could make an argument that foreign donors supported some of these groups, et cetera. But I think it was very natural and very authentic. So it was a case of sort of local peace builders seizing that moment and rescuing the transition.
Pauline.
Thank you so much. There's so many questions that come to mind from all of the speakers. I'll just try to think of the most urgent one for me. And the activists saying or advocacy on stopping the nuclear war sometimes overshadows the daily law conflicts like forced election conflicts that most people, that's their day-to-day life. And while nuclear is something, while it would affect them, it's not an immediate threat, while they can't sleep because something is shooting at them. And I'm just wondering how be able to balance the two in terms of education, but also advocacy. And also just identifying the challenges of the local heroes and how that has helped to have local heroes so that it's not the elders that we only see on TV who were coming to Kenya to negotiate peace between the two big people. But after they leave, it's not sustainable because the local people are wrong. And I think that brings to mind also the issue of what the US government is finding. Is it terrorism, the war against terrorism, or really sustainable local that may not have any direct consequences with the US, but it has very, very much with the local.
That question you ask about nuclear activism and local peace building activism is very close to my heart, because I still stay very close to Oxford Research Group and what they're doing and what their ambitions are. And all I can only answer it to you in terms of my personal energy. My personal energy is no longer, I have to say, and I don't say this proudly, is no longer on the nuclear fight. I've got excellent colleagues in the UK who are 100%, and they're very well trained and they're doing a beautiful job, but it's not where my heart lies now. My heart is in local conflict prevention, and I keep stressing this question of prevention because of the point that most people miss is that the fraction of the budgets that are spent on dealing with the fallout of conflict and mopping up the pieces or trying to, it's so minute, the amount that we actually direct towards prevention. And I fail to understand this. I think partly it's our responsibility to put forward more tangible, sturdy figures, but I don't know why. For example, in healthcare, maybe not now, but in past decades, the medical profession has been really hot on prevention. And why don't we apply the same to peace building? So that's really my passion at the moment, is how can we make prevention the new destiny for good funding?
It's a perfect segue to sharing with you all the fact that Mercy Corps has been working with a number of congressional leaders on the Violence Prevention and Stabilization Act, which is not yet dropped, but we are working on exactly that, trying to get the USA to first design strategies empirically and statistically a little bit using M&E data on what can work in very specific countries that we want Congress to tell them, ranging from Guatemala, Tunisia, to Kenya, etc. So that we're working on that legislation because we share that instinct that is so much more of an investment, or the return on investment for the American taxpayer is so much smarter for this sort of cheaper, low-cost, preventative peace building.
Are you using PeaceDirect's data as well?
We might. We're actually doing another study that's comparing, Mercy Corps, we're in the middle of the study to using PeaceDirect data to compare security sector assistance to peace building in a given country to show, that the effects of peace building data. And then we've just come out with a report that I can email to you all from Kandahar. We've been studying this question in Kandahar, CVE, and what is getting the youth, and what's persuading the youth not to join the Taliban in the hotbed of Taliban, central Afghanistan, during a very difficult time in Afghanistan. And we've been looking at which economic development tools and what combination of tools have any effect on CVE and radicalization. And this is an important study. It builds on Mercy Corps' work in Nigeria, Somalia, a few other very different contexts to see how development interventions have a peace building effect. Because our hunch is that one of the reasons USAID and others have not turned to their more comfortable mechanisms they'll never for prevention is they don't have the data to make the case in the interagency that it has a de-radicalizing effect or a conflict prevention effect. So we just found a real significant effect of a combination of development tools in Kandahar on changing political attitudes towards violence, and in fact, de-radicalizing youth as measured. We partnered with Yale and Princeton to do randomly controlled trials. We did a 12-month, 3-month, 6-month, 9-month, 12-month surveys, and we followed the same 1,600 members of our sample. So we're real proud of this data. So we do think that the key first step is to convince organizations like USAID that there's a combination of development tools that does have a de-radicalizing or conflict prevention effect. But there's pushback among other NGOs who say that's instrumentalizing development aid. So it's quite controversial. So I would just point out that as Mercy Price tried to lead the way and say, but it's very important to make the case that some of these interventions are not very expensive in relative terms and yet have this incredible preventative effect. We've taken some heat from the pure NGOs who don't like this instrumentalization of it. So I would just point that out. Data does exist, and I think the only solution here to make the policy case is data driven.
I think you're right, and what a lot of people come back to me from the British Foreign Office saying is, how do you actually measure something that didn't happen? And in the case that you're talking about, it's not so difficult. But when we're actually talking about a big outbreak of violence, post-election violence, for example, that didn't happen, how do you say what would have happened and how that was actually stopped and measure that? So it's a genuinely difficult science. Yes.
My observation and my advice would be getting a member of Congress in this political environment to sign up to, peace, no war is probably the wrong approach. However, if you say on Syria, do X, on Nigeria, do X, on Yemen, on North Korea, all 4 cases that, in fact, there has been legislative movement in a direction that's pro-peace, that's a far more strategic way to approach the issue in our current political climate. However, I would also add that there's an interesting coalition of Democrats and Republicans who are also much, much more isolationist and less interventionist. And those people are clearly joining on some of the country-specific legislative vehicles, push back on the Yemen war. Some of them are their problem with the Yemen war actually really might not be the human rights or civilian casualties or the other issues that the coalition is pushing. It might be quite simple, the sort of FCNL line of no to war, right? So point number 1 is, make your arguments more specific to the conflict and what should be done. But point number 2 is the opposite, which is but the political winds are such that there are new types of allies for the pro-peace arguments, and particularly the more isolationist members of both parties. And if you look at the public opinion polling, I point you to Pew polls from the fall. You probably saw them. I was fascinated. They broke down not just by party, but by factions of the party, and they had 8 different political views, I think 8 or 9. For Democratic, for Republican, and different types of views about internationalism versus isolationism. And there were real divisions among the different 9 groups about how much the U.S. should be a global leader engaged in the world. They asked the question 4 or 5 different times: how much spent on foreign aid, how much the U.S. should solve the world's problems. I mean, different ways of getting at this question. There was a clear majority in favor of internationalism, but only when you combine these different factions of the Republican Party to different factions of the Democratic Party. Yeah, I'm happy to send it to you.
I was just given yesterday this World Bank report, and I'm looking forward to getting into it. But I'm wondering if there are allies there, because it's a UN and World Bank publication. So I think from first glance at the contents, it looks like it might be interesting. But do you have an opinion?
I think it's a great report. We've worked a little bit with some of the authors at Mercy before they interviewed us, and some of their pretty specific. I agree. I think it could be a good.
Yeah, because, sure. It's called Pathways to Peace, and it's published last year by the World Bank and the UN. And the thing that struck me writing this book, and I probably should have noticed it years ago, but when I mapped where my country, the UK, was on the list of the top 5 arms sellers in the world, and I looked at how, the positions we've occupied on those top 5 arms sellers, and who the other countries were, I think it was 8 times out of 10, the top 5 were the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. And that made me think, well, no wonder Syria happened. It did. and better people than us have tried to reform the UN, but it's possible that it could still happen. I don't know.
I actually have a question. I mean, the last question actually made me think of this. I mean, both of you spoke about, I think, what we could think of as building constituencies for peace. So at the local level and Daphna here in Washington, within the bureaucracy. I'm wondering what the missing pieces are there. Are there constituencies that we don't often think about? For example, the American public writ large, right? I mean, and I feel like a lot of us missed the signs within the American public just in the last election in 2016. And what could we be doing to build that constituency within the U.S. public? Certainly, groups like FCNL does that, but perhaps not at the scale that it needs to be. And what lessons do you think we could draw from some of the work that you both have done?
The big one turns for me on women's role, because like you in Washington, we had a wonderful, noisy, colorful, joyous march after the inauguration, and lots of irony and lots of mockery and so forth. And we had a great time, but we did not use that constituency as we could have done. I don't think our public peace organizations really moved fast enough to even just to pass around for lists of emails and so forth. Nobody was doing that systematically. I imagine they were here. What happened here?
I would just say that I think there definitely was a movement, and I think where we're seeing it manifest is not maybe at the mass level we saw in the Women's March, but certainly at the local level, particularly for women running for public office now, not necessarily Congress, but even like local, city councils or whatever, which is really positive. I just want to also remark about this past weekend and high school students in Florida. I mean, this is stunning to me that we're seeing this kind of response. And it made me think of what was the term you used, your sensibility of what was happening on the ground with local peacemakers. I think we're seeing something different here. And it may not manifest immediately, but it is incredibly exciting.
I would just add on the response of domestic politics that the private sector seems like a natural ally for some, if not all. Maybe not the arms industry, who has separate interests, but although I've always had this a hunch or hope that maybe if you got Boeing and Lockheed in these groups and you said, you know what, do you really want Congress debating this arms sale, that arms sale, that arms sale? Why don't instead we give you some guidelines of some high risk? Anyway, that might just be too aspirational. But other industries really are and should be brought into debates. The private sector strikes me as a natural ally for stability, for the stability arguments. And again, how you frame it. I don't think maybe they're as interested in peace building, but if you frame it more generically in terms of stabilization and good governance, rule of law, transparency, I mean, there's a clear interest and incentive for American and British multinationals who want to invest in these countries, right? So that's a clear way to merge our interests. And then with the American public, this is something that we're wrestling with and we're supporting with the American NGO, hundreds of thousands of American donors who get small enough donations to meet their checkbooks, their way of engaging with international affairs, small donations for us and actually care. We're trying to figure out what are the issues these small donor Americans care about. And it's very hard to generalize, to be honest. We just run a trial balloon in January by Iraq. We thought Iraq's not really in the news. We're really curious what our list, 20,000 American donors, would think if we asked them to write to Congress to ensure that post-stabilization economic development is maintained in the budget, as an example, right? Americans are clearly very war-weary. They've heard about Iraq. They know about the billions of dollars. We're trying to test versus large American public. Puerto Rico seems to be an issue that really drove our stakeholders and constituents and our donors. Really interested in that having better advocates for the community. So, I think it's an open question. I think it's an issue. What part of internationalism or concern about peace building
I'd just like to add one thing to your question on the arms trade, because it's come up several times, and on and off for the last 20 years, we've been working on dialogue with the arms manufacturers, and frankly, we haven't got very far. But the one thing that does seem to be making a difference is not diversification, it's disinvestment. And as you probably know, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund took the decision, I think 3 years ago, to stop investing in uranium, plutonium, or any of the other fuels for nuclear. And everybody, all the experts said that their success would take a nosedive, and it didn't. And so now some very big international investment firms are thinking and talking seriously about disinvestment. And one of our jobs is to interest them in directing that towards arms production. Because once the financial support goes away, then the argument that my country, I don't know if yours is the same, but the argument that's been hardwired into the British psyche is that defense jobs are sacred to the economy. And it's not true. A study was done in 1994 that showed that if the same government subsidy for R&D and export credit guarantees were applied to the production of socially useful goods, you could create twice as many jobs for the same subsidy.
Okay, I'm looking at this right now. When I said bureaucratically know your adversaries, I meant just as much the counter arguments, and this is one of the counter arguments that people, in this field need to master, right? Which is this counter argument in country-specific cases that you can't stop weapons sales because it will hurt American jobs, and the counter argument continues, and therefore American jobs will go to Chinese and Russian. So it's not only you will lose American jobs if you do the right thing with weapons sales to the country, but you will cede to your competitors' base, right? So that's part of the counter argument that is very important in some of these discussions on the side. And so yes, there's a number of us who were working on some of these issues in the Middle East, Obama years, who've been looking at the data, and I also saw the study that showed clearly that not only was it the jobs were not sustaining, the growth wasn't as big compared to others. So that might be not enough to make that argument to people in the Pentagon who are very worried about defense industry, right? Because part of the mission, there is a national security interest, of course, investment in U.S. R&D U.S. So there's the complication with this line of thinking is that there's a personal national security or patriotic national security agenda as well, right? So anyway, but yes.
To your point about conversion, a few years ago, we were seeing a point where there actually were starting to be some military spending in the U.S., or at least an aspect of the conversation, and there was a lot of excitement about similar data in the U.S. that shows it's spending more time about education sector, energy, and the data was all good. And then like ISIS came up in there, and suddenly like the appetite was gone. And it wasn't that people were threatened to change. There was a good boogeyman that people could cling on to, and suddenly there was no more appetite for military cuts. There was suddenly a narrative for further growth and to wartime levels. And we, as the Department of Service Committee, wrestle a lot with issues of underlying narrative. How to move that sense of what creates real security and what creates well-being. And I mean, I think it's often in those spaces where that bigger conversation about what's real in the community, it's some of what you're talking about in terms of nitty-gritty of government. What words you can use, what ideas have heard. And I guess my question is just, how do you create the growth of narrative that help these important pragmatic arguments not get washed out?
I've seen narrative in Washington change really quite quickly on this topic. So in Iraq, when ISIS started marching to Baghdad, the narrative immediately changed from weapons sales to what? $25 billion worth of FMS to not prevent or to not enable the Iraqi security forces, the ISF, that we, the United States, have been training for 15 years to shield them. So immediately overnight, when the effectiveness began to deteriorate, right, there was a quickness and willingness to start questioning. And then you saw a bunch of GAO reports about this exact question, which is why did the ISF fold so quickly? Why was ISIS able to, why were all these people defecting? What had happened in the training? So I don't think that some of these arguments are impenetrable. I think they are easy to influence, or not easy to influence, but influenceable, if you make the right statistically based or kind of longitudinally based arguments about cause and effect. I do think if I were working on Iraq right now, you know, in Iraq only, I would make the argument that after 2007, 2009, the international community believed that funding the international security forces was the best way to stabilize the country, and indeed that was not sufficient, or certainly wasn't effective, and so therefore, you know, so to look for the other more economic building interventions that might protect the community like Mosul from the repeat the third time, you know, from AQI to ISIS to whatever the third iteration of the radicalism is in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So I think there is enough sympathy for that argument based on what happened to make that argument to me. It's clearly harder when you don't have the data of a failed, you know, weapons training program.
And just on that one excuse that's given today, we don't supply the arms to well. That would be argument.
So I think we have time for one more question, and Jim in the back.
Changes in personnel, we tend to lose follow, or we tend to lose interest. I mean, I think as Americans, we are not only short-sighted, but we also tend to want to fix questions and move on. So how do you change that? I mean, we use the example of 10 years earlier. I would argue that Burundi at this time, perhaps 10 years earlier, was an even better example, where you had initiatives by not only U.S. ambassadors, but other ambassadors in the UN system, who then reached out locally and were able to coordinate things. That what was a good model sort of went away. And I think that contributed over time getting us where we are.
Can I just add to that question? Glenn wrote the example, and I was working at USA when everyone was very happy about that. You know, it felt like if everyone had voted together, it was a successful example. And then the president of the Youth Association, million young people around Kenya, network that we built USA funding, comes to USA and says to me finally, oh yeah, you did another like that. And so there's this flurry of trying to ask what's going on in high-ups, you know, the basis, what? Wait, I can remember that. And so this tendency to jump from one to another zero sustainability. This is why public red is so critical, because those are the people that are there, but our funding mechanism and our attention span is so poor when it comes to actual sustainable peace. So this issue of time frames, and then you look at Congress, they're usually on 2 years, like election time, and our struggle on the time frames. So, I mean, how do we fix that challenge?
So I noted in the Elie Wiesel Act that there was a provision about training foreign service officers on these issues, which I thought was quite brilliant. I never saw a situation in the past 10 years where something good and strategic and proactive and successful had been done without the chief of mission, the U.S. ambassador, having eyes on the situation, getting the in brief when he or she came in, and hearing about what had happened, you know, knowing the story of what had worked and not worked in the past 5 years. instilling that, learning from it, and then proceeding. And so I never saw good things happen without the chief of mission as the point. And there are many cases where the chief of mission, didn't do those things. But I really do believe that, the success of American government to do good in the world, high-level career people who've learned from Burundi and were junior officers, and then can bring that to Kenya when inevitably there's another election. So I kind of take away, sadly, from the experience of political communities and people that talk in Congress will never have the degree of patience and the degree of sustainability. And that's why it's actually really one of the biggest dangers in international security and stability right now is the personnel attrition at the State Department. Senior people, are leaving or being so that to me, that Congress could just attend to that alone would be a future investment in ensuring that the case study
So we are at time. I wanted to just give both of you, if you had any final words that you wanted to leave with us. But we do have a little bit more time afterwards. Feel free to come up and chat. There's more food in the back. Sorry? We have books for sale. So please feel free. But I wanted to turn it over to you if you had any last words.
I'd just like to ask Kenyan friends whether you've got the last word for us.
Thank you. I think the key is one of the situations where we don't deal with infrastructure issues. We don't have the ethnic, the distribution problem. So we just come and put funding every time, and we try to without addressing the and so we will repeat the same cycle next election because nothing.
Thank you so much.
But I just want to say what an honor it is to meet you, and I look forward to reading the book and compete with it.
Well, it's been a great to and fro, I think. For two different kinds of expertise. And I'm delighted to have been here.
Thank you.
Hosting this.